Imagine waking up one morning, stretching your arms, walking downstairs, and realizing everyone is gone. No note, no goodbye, just silence. At first, you think maybe they've gone out for breakfast or a quick errand. But as the hours pass, unease turns into confusion. You check the bedrooms, their suitcases are gone. You call, and no one picks up. And then finally, when someone does, the voice on the other end isn't warm or apologetic. It's cold, almost amused. "Oh, we forgot to tell you. We left for our honeymoon. We'll be back in a week. Don't be so dramatic." And then the final slap in the face. "Oh, and make sure the house is clean before we get back." At that moment, something inside me snapped. They had walked out without a second thought. So I made sure they'd never walk back in. I never thought I'd be the one to slam the door in my father's face. But when the moment came, I felt no regret. Growing up, I never really felt like I had a home. My parents divorced when I was 7, and from then on, I was passed. Back and forth like a package. Half the month with my mom, half with my dad. But even as a child, I could feel the difference. With my mom, I was seen. I was heard. She knew my favorite bedtime stories, remembered the names of my stuffed animals, and made my lunch just the way I liked it. With my dad, I was an obligation. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't cruel, but he was always too busy. Too busy with work, too busy with women, too busy with anything that wasn't me. And so, when my mother passed away suddenly at 47, my world collapsed. She left me our family home, the place where I grew up, the place where she made me feel safe. My father barely reacted when I told him. He just sighed and said, "Well, I guess that's what she wanted." I should have seen it then, the resentment in his voice. Because that house, he wanted it back. A year after my mom's passing, my dad called me out of the blue. "I'm getting married." His voice was light, excited even, the happiest I'd heard him in years. Her name was Julia, a woman 10 years younger than him, with 2 daughters from a previous relationship. My dad had never introduced a girlfriend to the family before, so when he brought Julia and her daughters to a family dinner, we were all surprised. At first, things seemed fine. Julia was sweet, her daughters were shy but polite, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, this could be a fresh start. Then my father asked me, "Can we move in with you before the wedding?" I hesitated. I had spent the past year alone in the house, and though it was lonely, it was my loneliness. But they seemed nice, and maybe it would be good to have people around again. So I said yes. I would regret that decision. At first, everything was fine. Julia was still warm, still friendly. Her daughters were quiet, but we coexisted peacefully. And then, 3 days after the wedding, I woke up to an empty house. I called my dad. No answer. I called Julia. No answer. Hours passed before Julia finally picked up. "Oh, we forgot to tell you. We went on our honeymoon. We'll be back in a week. Don't be so dramatic." I was stunned. They had packed their bags, left the house, and didn't even bother to tell me? Then her voice changed. "You're not a child anymore. Your dad has a new family now. You need to accept that and stop acting like everything revolves around you." And then, the final insult. "Oh, and make sure the house is clean before we get back." I hung up. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. I had lost my mother. And now, my father had abandoned me all over again. That night, I barely slept. I kept tossing and turning, replaying Julia's words over and over in my head. "You're not a child anymore. Your dad has a new family now. Make sure the house is clean before we get back." The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. They had treated me like a placeholder, like I was just a temporary occupant in my own home, until they decided to claim it for themselves, and suddenly I saw everything clearly. They had never planned to leave. They didn't just want to live with me. They wanted to take over. All those months of playing nice, acting like we were one big happy family. It was all a setup. Julia probably thought that by the time the wedding was over, I'd be too comfortable, too emotionally attached to say, no. Or maybe she thought I was too weak to stand up for myself. Well, she was about to learn otherwise. I woke up early the next morning, went to the store, and bought a brand new set of locks. Then, I spent the entire afternoon packing up every single thing they owned. Clothes, toiletries, shoes, even the ridiculous little decorative pillows Julia had insisted on putting in the guest room. I didn't fold them neatly. I didn't organize them with care. I shoved everything into boxes, taped them up, and dragged them outside. By the time I was done, the front yard looked like a moving truck had spit out their belongings onto the grass. Then I locked the door, and, for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. The next night my dad called. I let it ring 3 times before answering, just to make him sweat. The moment I picked up, his voice exploded through the phone. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I stayed silent. "You had no right to touch our things. And what is this about changing the locks? Do you think this is funny?" I took a slow, deep breath. Then calmly I said, "This is my house. You don't live here anymore." There was a long pause. Then my father let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Are you serious? Over what? Because we didn't tell you we were leaving for a week? Are you really that childish?" I clenched my jaw. That wasn't the point, and he knew it. "You don't get to walk in and out of my life whenever you feel like it," I said, my voice steady. "You don't get to treat this house, my house, like your backup plan." "We're family," he shot back. "Family doesn't turn their backs on each other." I almost laughed at that. "Funny, because that's exactly what you did to me." Silence. For the first time, my father didn't have an immediate comeback. I wasn't the desperate little girl who just wanted his attention anymore. I wasn't the quiet, obedient daughter who accepted every crumb of affection he threw my way. I had nothing to prove to him. "Take your stuff and go," I said. "If I see you or Julia on my property again, I'll call the cops." He cursed under his breath. Then, before I could hang up, he spat out, "You're a selfish, ungrateful brat. Your mother would be disgusted if she saw what you've become." I felt the familiar sting in my chest, the mention of my mother, the attempt to weaponize her memory against me, but this time it didn't work. "Goodbye, Dad," and I hung up. A few days later, the truth came out. My father had lost his job months before the wedding, but instead of being responsible, he spent his savings on a lavish wedding and a honeymoon he couldn't afford. Now, he had no money left. Julia, realizing he was broke, left him immediately, running back to her ex, the man who had paid for their return flight. Desperate, my father called me, begging for forgiveness. "Please let me come back. You're all I have left." But I was done. For years he had put everything ahead of me. Now, when he had nothing left, he suddenly wanted to be my father again? I let him finish talking. Then, with the calmest voice I could manage, I said, "Goodbye, Dad." And I hung up for the last time. I expected to feel guilt, regret, maybe even sadness. But all I felt was relief. For so many years, I had convinced myself that family was everything, that no matter what, you had to forgive, had to compromise, had to hold on. But family isn't about shared DNA. It's about love, respect, and trust. And my father had never given me any of those things. For the first few weeks, he kept calling. Sometimes he was angry, sometimes he was pleading. He left voicemails, long, rambling messages about how I was throwing away our relationship, how I was letting my emotions ruin everything. I ignored them all. Then one night, he tried a new tactic. I lost my job. Julia left me. I have nowhere else to go. For a split second, a tiny wounded part of me almost caved. But then, I thought back to the way Julia had spoken to me. I thought about the suitcases gone without a word, I thought about the resentment in my father's voice when he realized the house was mine and not his, and I realized something. My father didn't miss me. He missed what I could give him, and I wasn't about to sacrifice myself just to make his life easier. So, I blocked his number. I stopped checking for messages, and for the first time in my life, I put myself first. Now, months later, I sit in my living room, the same living room where I once felt so alone, and I feel something different. Peace. Stability. Freedom. I used to believe that being alone was the worst thing in the world, that having family, any family, was better than nothing. But I was wrong. Being alone isn't scary. Being surrounded by people who don't love you, that's scary. My father made his choice a long time ago. Now, I had finally made mine. I wasn't his safety net. I wasn't his backup plan. I wasn't his doormat. And if he ever came knocking again, I wouldn't open the door. Thank you for watching. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories like this.